The obsidian citadel of the Orcian hegemony did not sit upon the surface of the planet Xylos, but rather hovered in the electrically charged atmosphere of the gas giant's upper thermosphere, a monolith of black stone and shimmering containment fields that defied the crushing gravity below through ancient, forgotten manipulation of mass fields. Inside the high synod chamber, the air was thick, not just with the recycled mix of nitrogen and trace sulfur that the Orcian breathed, but with a palpable, suffocating dread that transcended species boundaries, a heavy psychological weight that pressed down upon the carapace of High Chancellor Threx, until he felt his very exoskeleton might fracture under the strain of the silence. The chamber was vast, a cavernous sphere of dark architecture lit only by the bioluminescent glow of the delegates, and the terrifying crimson hologram dominating the center of the room, a three-dimensional tactical map of the galactic spiral arm, where entire sectors were blinking out of existence, turning from the comforting blue of Allied control to the static gray of total annihilation. Threx shifted his bulk, his four primary eyes narrowing as he looked across the circular podiums where the representatives of the Galactic Concordat sat in various states of panic and resignation. There were the Lyran matriarchs, floating in their suspension tanks, their telepathic sorrow leaking into the minds of everyone present like a cold dampness. There were the cybernetic Korsh, usually so logical and unshakable, now frantically processing data streams that offered zero probability of survival. And there were the proud Vanir warriors, whose fur was matted with the stress of a dozen lost campaigns, their honor broken by an enemy that did not care for duels or glory. The enemy was known only as the Pale Tide, a sweeping, devouring force of biological silence that did not conquer, did not enslave, and did not negotiate. It simply erased, leaving dead worlds and empty void in its wake, expanding with a geometric progression that had defied every containment strategy the Concordat had thrown at it for 20 standard cycles. The Ninth Fleet has gone silent, the Korsh representative, Subnode 77, announced, its synthesized voice devoid of its usual arrogant cadence, replaced by a flat harmonic tremor that indicated a logic fault in its fear subroutines. The sensor buoys in the Antares Rift detected the tide's vanguard signatures 3 standard hours ago. Now, nothing, no debris, no distress beacons, just absence. The statistical model for the survival of the core worlds has dropped below 2%. A ripple of terrified movement passed through the chamber. The Vanir representative slammed a heavy, clawed fist onto the metallic railing of his pod, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the grand hall. But there was no aggression in the gesture, only the impotent rage of a soldier who realizes his weapon is useless. Threx watched them all, feeling the age in his joints, feeling the history of his people, a history of conquest, of trade, of art, crumbling into dust before his eyes. He knew what had to be done. He knew what the whispering in the lower corridors had been about for the last cycle. He knew what the unauthorized data packets circulating between the desperate captains of the remaining fleets contained. They were talking about the ban. They were talking about the sealed archives. They were talking about the one species the Concordat had unanimously voted to exile from the theater of war 300 years ago, not out of malice, but out of a collective, primal terror that had scarred the psyche of the galaxy so deeply that even facing extinction seemed preferable to inviting them back. But extinction was no longer a theoretical abstraction. It was knocking on the door of the Xylos system, and the door was buckling. We have exhausted all conventional options, Matriarch Yalara of the Lyran spoke, her voice projecting directly into their minds, soft and mournful, carrying the sensation of deep, crushing water. The antimatter barrages failed, the singularity mines failed, the psychic screams of our choir only fed the tide. We are dying, Threx. The Concordat is a corpse that has not yet realized it is dead. There is only one variable left, one forbidden variable. The silence that followed her mental projection was absolute, heavier than the gravity of the gas giant below, as every eye in the chamber turned toward Threx, the keeper of the seal, the only one with the biometric authority to unlock the transgalactic relay. He felt the weight of their gaze, the desperation of billions of lives resting on his decision, and he hated them for it, hated them for forcing him to be the one to unleash the monsters they had all sworn to forget. The humans. The word itself was taboo in polite diplomatic circles, a relic of a darker age when the Concordat was young and foolish, when they had mistaken tea. He Terrans for just another primitive, kinetic-obsessed species stumbling into the stars. They had been wrong. Oh, by the Maker's void, they had been so wrong. Threx closed his eyes, remembering the history lessons, the suppressed recordings of the Velosian conflict, The only war the humans had fully participated in before the ban was enacted. It hadn't been a war. It had been a dismantling of reality, a cold, calculated imposition of order that stripped the enemy not just of their lives, but of their will, their logic, and their future. To summon them is to admit that our civilization is a failure, Threx rumbled, his voice grating like grinding stones, his mandibles clicking in agitation. You do not understand what you ask. You look at the history books and you see victory. I look at the archives and I see the death of ethics. I see a species that does not fight with passion or honor, but with an efficiency that renders existence itself gray. If we call the Terran Union, we are not inviting allies. We are inviting the end of war, and whatever comes after that may be worse than the tide. The Vanir representative snarled, baring fangs that were useless against the encroaching dark. Better a gray existence than the silence of the grave, Chancellor. The tide eats our flesh and repurposes our biomass. The humans. The humans just frightened our grandfathers. We are warriors. We can handle their arrogance. We can handle their kinetic savagery. We need guns, Threx. We need ships. We need the species that turned the Velosian homeworld into a parking lot. Threx looked at the Vanir with pity. They truly didn't understand. They thought the humans were banned because they were too violent, because they used excessive force. That was the lie told to the public to keep the peace. The truth was far more disturbing. Humans weren't banned because they were berserkers. They were banned because they were architects of inevitable outcomes. They were banned because when a human walked onto a battlefield, the battlefield ceased to be a place of chance and became a solved equation. It is not their guns I fear, General, Threx whispered, his hand hovering over the interface console embedded in his podium. It is their silence. It is their capacity to look at a living, breathing enemy and see only data to be deleted. He looked up at the hologram, watching another red blotch consume the rim sector, extinguishing 3 sentient species in the time it took to draw a breath. The decision was no longer his. The universe had forced his hand. With a trembling claw, Threx entered the sequence, a code that had not been used for 3 centuries, a sequence of prime numbers and harmonic frequencies that would pierce the subspace barrier and reach the isolated, quarantined sector of space where the Terran Union had agreed to remain, patiently, silently waiting for the galaxy to grow up or die. The console flashed a warning, a stark crimson glyph that translated to irreversible action. Confirm designation, Apex Protocol. Threx pressed the confirmation rune. The chamber lights flickered. A low, throbbing hum began to resonate through the floor, vibrating the fluid in the Lyran tanks and rattling the cybernetics of the Korsh. The signal was sent. The request was made. The ban was lifted. The response was immediate, terrifyingly so. There was no negotiation, no request for clarification, no diplomatic preamble. The massive holographic map in the center of the room flickered and changed. The red tide of the enemy remained, but a new icon appeared. A single, stark white point of light appearing not at the edge of the galaxy, but directly in the center of the tactical display in the high orbit of Xylos, right outside their hull. The sensors screamed. The Korsh subnode 77 convulsed as its processors were overwhelmed by the sudden influx of telemetry. Gravimetric shear detected, it shrieked. Mass reading is negligible, energy reading is infinite. It makes no sense. The sensors are registering a vessel, but it has no engine signature, no exhaust, no thermal bloom. It is simply their asterisk. The view screen on the far wall, a massive pane of transparent aluminum alloy, polarized instantly to protect their eyes as a tear in the fabric of spacetime opened just kilometers off the Citadel's bow. It wasn't the swirling, chaotic vortex of a jump drive, nor the brutal punch of a warp entry. It was a clean, surgical incision in reality, a perfect square of absolute darkness that rotated slowly against the backdrop of the gas giant's storm clouds. And from that square the ship emerged. It was not the dreadnought the Vanir had hoped for. It was not a bristling fortress of guns and missiles. It was a sleek matte white needle, smooth and unbroken by windows or weapon ports, perhaps 2 kilometers long but impossibly thin, resembling a shard of bleached bone or a solidified ray of light. It hung there, motionless, ignoring the turbulent, atmospheric winds of the gas giant, anchored in space by forces the Orcian could not comprehend. A signal overrode the Citadel's communication grid, not audio, but a direct text interface that scrolled across every screen in the chamber, translated simultaneously into the native script of every species present. The message was brief, devoid of greeting, and chilling in its neutrality. Project, Omega active, ban lift confirmed, assets deployed, designation, humanity, status, observing. Then the audio kicked in. It was a human voice, calm, resonant, and sounding almost bored, stripped of the panic that had defined the last year of the Concordat's existence. This is Admiral Julian Vance of the USC Syllogism **. We received your distress beacon. We note the breakdown of the Galactic Concordat's defensive capabilities. We note the encroachment of the biological substrate designated the Pale Tide. We are here to finalize the dispute. Finalize. The Vannier general sputtered, confused. We need you to fight. Where's your fleet? Where are your support vessels? That needle is all you sent. The Tide has a bioarmada numbering in the trillions. They will swallow that sliver of metal whole. Threx stared at the white ship, a cold knot forming in his stomach. He remembered the archives. He leaned into the microphone. Admiral Vance, this is High Chancellor Threx. We acknowledge your arrival. The enemy is overwhelming. We request immediate fire support for the evacuation of the core worlds. We cannot hold the line. There was a pause, a silence that stretched for seconds before Vance's voice returned, tinged with a confusing mixture of politeness and condescension. Chancellor Threx, we do not provide fire support. We do not participate in holding actions. You invoked the Apex Protocol. You lifted the ban. That implies you are ready for the solution. We are not soldiers, Chancellor. We are engineers of outcome. Please transmit all data regarding the Tide's biological frequency and command hierarchy. We will assess the necessary alterations to the local physics package. Alterations? Matriarch Yalara's mental voice wavered. We do not understand. The Tide is a physical threat. They are consuming us. We are aware, Vance replied. Please stand by. We are sending a delegation to your chamber to facilitate the integration of our systems. Do not be alarmed by the transit method. Before Threx could ask what transit method meant, the air in the center of the council chamber shimmered. There was no sound of teleportation, no flash of light. The space simply folded and three figures stepped out of the distortion as if stepping through a curtain. The aliens recoiled, guards raising their weapons instinctively before Threx barked a command to stand down. The humans stood in the center of the alien hegemony, looking terrifyingly ordinary. There were no power armor suits, no heavy pulse rifles, no cybernetic combat implants visible on their skin. They wore simple, pressed uniforms of a dark gray fabric that seemed to absorb the light, adorned only by a small silver emblem on the chest, a stylized representation of a human hand holding a burning atom. The leader, presumably Admiral Vance, was an older male with graying hair and eyes that looked like shattered flint. He was flanked by two others, a female holding a datapad of transparent glass and a large male who stood with his hands clasped behind his back, observing the terrified aliens with the detached curiosity of a scientist looking at microbes. Chancellor, Vance nodded, his movement minimal, efficient. It has been 300 years. You look tired. We are facing extinction, Admiral, Threx said, rising to his full height, trying to muster the dignity of his station despite the fear radiating from his council. We expected the legends, the planet breakers, the void walkers. Vance looked around the room, his gaze lingering on the red hologram of the dying galaxy. We moved past planet breaking a long time ago, Chancellor. It's messy, inefficient, and as for the ban. He walked toward the hologram, walking through the projection of a dying star system without flinching. You banned us because you said we took the soul out of warfare. You said we made it cold. You were right. We spent the last 3 centuries in the dark refining that coldness. We didn't build bigger guns. We built better answers. The Tide is here, the Vannier general shouted, pointing at the sensor display. They have entered the system. Their vanguard is breaching the upper atmosphere. We are wasting time talking. If you have a weapon, use it. The room shook violently. The Citadel's shields flared as the first wave of the Pale Tide's bioplasma bombardment struck the outer hull. Red warning lights bathed the chamber in the color of blood. The course representative began emitting a high-pitched distress signal. Hull integrity at 80%. Swarming, millions of bio-drones. We are being overrun. Vance didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the ceiling where the explosions were reverberating. He glanced at his female aide. Lieutenant Corrine analysis. The woman tapped her glass pad. Biological markers confirmed. Hive mind structure distributed processing. Relies on rapid cellular regeneration and quantum-entangled communication nodes. It's a Type 4 aggressor swarm. Primitive but effective against kinetic shields. Recommendation? Vance asked, as if discussing what to order for dinner while the station around them groaned under the assault. Severance, she said simply, or total entropic dampening. Severance is cleaner, leaves the biomass intact for recycling. Agreed, Vance said. He turned to Threx. Chancellor, we are going to assume direct control of the local engagement theater. Please order your fleets to power down their weapons and withdraw to a safe distance, at least 10,000 kilometers. Withdraw. Threx stared at him in disbelief. If we lower our shields and stop firing, we will be consumed in seconds. You will not be consumed. Vance said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying that terrifying absolute certainty that Threx remembered from the archives. But if you continue to fire your primitive antimatter rounds while we are working, you might introduce chaotic variables into our calculations. And we hate variables. Stand down, Chancellor, or we leave. Threat hung in the air, sharper than any blade. Threx looked at the human, looked at the crumbling shields, looked at the panic in the eyes of the proud Vanir. They had no choice. They had opened the door, they had to walk through it. "Order the fleet," Threx whispered into the comms. "All vessels, cease fire, withdraw to the designated coordinates, lower shields." "Chancellor, that is suicide," the fleet commander screamed over the link. "Do it," Threx roared, his voice cracking. "Do it, or we are all dead anyway." The order went out. Above the gas giant, the ragged remnants of the Concordat fleet stopped their desperate barrage. Their engines flared as they pulled back, leaving the obsidian citadel and the single white human ship alone against the approaching wall of biological horror. The pale tide, sensing the weakness, surged forward. It was a visible wave of flesh, chitin, and teeth, a cloud of millions of bioships the size of city blocks, screaming silently across the void. They blotted out the sun. They swallowed the radar. Vance nodded to the large man behind him. "Sergeant authorized the asterisk syllogism to engage via protocol, stasis lock." "Aye, sir," the man whispered into a collar mic. What happened next was not an explosion, it was not a beam of light, it was the sudden, violent intrusion of asterisk physics where physics had no business being manipulated. The white ship, the asterisk syllogism asterisk, pulsed once. A ripple of distortion, like a heat haze on a desert road, expanded outward from the vessel in a perfect sphere. It moved faster than light, washing over the citadel, washing over the retreating alien fleet, passing through them harmlessly, and then impacting the pale tide. Instantaneously, the tide stopped. Not just their movement, their existence seemed to freeze. The millions of bioships, the plasma bolts in mid-flight, the writhing tentacles of the hive mothers, everything caught within the sphere of influence simply halted. Inertia vanished. Thermal energy dropped to absolute zero in the space occupied by the enemy, but without the shattering effect of freezing. They were suspended in a state of absolute imposed stasis. The silence in the council chamber was deafening. The explosions had stopped. The shaking had stopped. The red lights were still flashing, but the sensors were reading. Nothing. "What? What did you do?" the Vanir general whispered, his eyes wide, staring at the screen where the terrifying enemy fleet was now a motionless sculpture of frozen meat. "We removed the concept of kinetic energy from their reference frame," Vance said calmly, adjusting his cuffs. "It's a localized reality anchor. As long as the asterisk syllogism projects the field, they are effectively distinct from the flow of time. They cannot move, they cannot think, they cannot decay. They are paused." Threx felt his breath catch in his throat. This was power beyond nuclear fire. This was godhood. You froze them. For how long?" "Indefinitely," Vance replied. "But that is just the containment. Now comes the removal." He turned to Lieutenant Kareen. "Initiate the disassembly algorithm. Filter for sentient consciousness. If any of the hive mind nodes show high-level sapience, preserve them for interrogation. Convert the rest to base elements." "Understood," she tapped the pad. Outside, the frozen fleet began to dissolve. It wasn't violent. It was like watching sugar dissolve in hot water. The terrifying bioships, the monsters that had eaten a dozen worlds, simply flaked away, turning into clouds of harmless hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen. The white ship was rewriting their molecular bonds, stripping them down to the atomic level with a precision that was horrifying to behold. In minutes, the pale tide, the greatest threat the galaxy had ever known, was reduced to a colorful nebula of gas, drifting lazily in the upper atmosphere of Xylos. "Target eliminated," Kareen said. "Biomass conversion complete. The local atmosphere has been enriched with oxygen and nitrogen. You should see a 4% improvement in air quality on the station, Chancellor." The council stared. They stared at the humans who looked bored. They stared at the screen where the enemy was gone, not defeated, not retreated, gone asterisk. "This." The Lyran matriarch's mind voice was trembling with a fear far deeper than what she had felt for the tide. "This is why you were banned. You do not fight, you edit." Vance turned to look at her, his expression softening slightly, but his eyes remaining hard. "War is a failure of communication or a failure of resources. We solved the resource problem. We solved the communication problem. When we encounter something that refuses to communicate and refuses to share, we solve the existence problem. We told you centuries ago. We don't play games. You wanted your honor, your glorious battles, your struggles against the odds. We respected that. We left. But now you called us back." He stepped closer to Threx. "And now that we are back, Chancellor, the rules have changed. The ban is lifted, which means the Terran Union is no longer observing the prime directive of non-interference. We are taking the reins." Taking the reins, Threx stepped back. We asked for help, we did not ask to be conquered. You aren't being conquered, Vance said, his voice devoid of ambition but heavy with responsibility. You are being managed. Look at your galaxy, Threx. Look at the mess. Constant wars, resource shortages, piracy, this pale tide allowed to fester for 20 years because you were too busy arguing over trade tariffs to build a unified fleet. It's inefficient, it's chaotic, it ends today. Vance signaled the sergeant. Deploy the logistics network. I want fabricator ships in orbit of every core world within 12 hours. Begin the atmospheric scrubbers, repair the damaged infrastructure, and disarm the local fleets. Disarm. The Vannier general roared, reaching for his sidearm. I will not surrender my... Before he could draw the weapon, the Vannier general froze. He didn't turn to ice, he just stopped moving, his muscles locked by an invisible force. Please, Vance sighed, looking pained. The syllogism is monitoring all aggressive intent within the chamber. Your neural impulses were dampened before they reached your hand. We are not taking your weapons to oppress you. We are taking them because you are children playing with matches, and you almost burned the house down. The general collapsed as the field released him, gasping for air, his pride shattered. Threx looked at the human admiral, realizing the true magnitude of what had happened. Humanity hadn't been hiding in the dark because they were afraid. They had been hiding because they had evolved into something that the rest of the galaxy couldn't coexist with, a civilization of absolute, terrifying competence. They were the adults in a room full of squabbling toddlers. What happens now? Threx asked, his voice barely a whisper. Now, Vance looked at the star map where the red zones were already being updated to blue as human ships jumped into sector after sector, erasing the tide with the same casual ease. Now we fix the damage, we restore the ecosystems, we optimize your governments, we integrate you into the Union. And if we refuse, Vance smiled, a sad, tired smile, you won't. Because for the first time in your history, your children will not die of hunger, your soldiers will not die in muddy trenches, your sick will be cured, you will trade your freedom to make mistakes for a guaranteed future. It is the choice we made long ago, it is the price of peace. The weeks that followed were a blur of impossible activity. The human fleet was not a military force, but a construction corps. Massive geometric ships appeared over the ravaged worlds of the Concordat. They didn't drop bombs, they dropped nanite swarms that rebuilt cities in days. They dropped atmospheric processors that scrubbed radiation from the skies. They dropped medical centers that cured plagues considered incurable for millennia. The pale tide was erased from the galaxy in less than a standard month. There were no battles, just arrivals, silences, and disappearances. The war was a series of deletions, but the tension in the Citadel did not vanish, it transmuted. The alien leaders watched their saviors with a mix of awe and horror. The humans were polite, distant, and utterly unyielding. They reorganized the galactic economy, dismantling the predatory trade guilds of the Orcian and replacing them with resource distribution algorithms that eliminated poverty but also eliminated profit. They disbanded the Vannier warrior castes, retraining them as explorers and engineers, stripping them of their cultural identity as killers. They integrated the Korsh cyber networks into their own, vastly superior datasphere, effectively making the cyborgs part of the human cloud. It was peace. It was paradise. And it was terrifyingly sterile. Threx sat in his private quarters looking out at the gas giant xylos. The storms had been calmed. The harvesting platforms were running at 300% efficiency. He should have been happy, but he felt like a specimen in a jar. He requested a private audience with Admiral Vance, who had established a temporary command post in the old war room. Vance accepted. When Threx entered, he found the human standing over a new holographic map, one that showed not just the galaxy but the void beyond it. It is perfect, Threx said, the word tasting like ash. You have made the galaxy perfect, Admiral, and you have killed our spirit. Vance didn't turn around. Spirit is a luxury of the survivors, Chancellor. We ensured survival. Is that all there is? Threx asked, stepping closer. You possess the power of gods, you manipulate reality. And you use it to play nanny to a galaxy of lesser races? Why did you really come back? You could have stayed in the dark, you could have let the tide eat us. Why do you care? Vance finally turned. His face was grave, the lines of age seemingly deeper than before. He tapped the console and the map zoomed out. It zoomed out past the galaxy, past the local cluster, into the deep, terrifying black of the intergalactic void. You asked why we were banned, Vance said softly. And you asked why we accepted the ban. You thought we were ashamed of our violence. We weren't. We were preparing. Preparing for what? The tide, Vance gestured to the map. The pale tide was not a natural evolution, Threx. It was a biological weapon, a probe. Threx felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. A probe sent by whom? By the ones we are fighting, Vance said. You see, the Concordat lives in a bubble. You fight over planets and resources. We, the Union. We have been fighting a war on the edge of the universe for 500 years. The ban was a quarantine. We didn't want you involved. We wanted you safe inside the cradle while we held the door shut. The map shifted, showing the edge of the universe. There, pushing against the fabric of reality, was a darkness that wasn't just empty space. It was a jagged, fracturing corruption, a purple bruising of the cosmos where physics was breaking down. The pale tide was a leak, Vance explained. A tiny drop of oil from a leaking engine that dripped into your galaxy. You struggled against it for 20 years. We fight the engine itself every day. Threx stared at the scale of the conflict shown on the screen. The corruption was larger than 10,000 galaxies, and holding the line against it was a thin, shimmering wall of white light, millions of human ships linked together, burning their reality anchors to keep the universe from dissolving. The enemy, Vance continued, is entropy. Not the natural decay of time, but a weaponized entropy from a parallel brain collision. It wants to unravel the laws of physics. We learned to manipulate those laws so we could reinforce them. That is why we are so good at editing reality. We have to be. If we fail, the concept of atom ceases to exist. So, you came back, Threx stammered, his mind reeling. We came back because the leak meant our wall had a crack, Vance said grimly. The tide was a symptom. The fact that it got in means the enemy is pushing harder. We came back to stabilize your galaxy, to resource strip it, efficiently, sustainably, and to recruit you. Recruit us. We cannot hold the wall alone anymore, Vance admitted, his voice heavy with a vulnerability Threx had never seen. We are tired, Chancellor. We are so very tired. We have been the guardians of existence for 3 centuries, alone in the dark, fighting a war no one knew was happening. We need the Vanier's aggression. We need the Korsh's processing power. We need the Lyran's psychic reach. We need the Orokin's logistics. Vance walked over to Threx and placed a hand on the alien's shoulder. It was a warm, human gesture, shocking in its intimacy. We band ourselves to protect you from the truth of the universe, but the truth is here. We aren't the monsters, Threx. We are the shield, and the shield is cracking. Threx looked into the human's eyes. He saw the sorrow there. He saw the burden of a species that had given up its childhood, its joy, and its reputation to stand in the cold void and hold back the night so that others could play at war in the safety of the crib. The resentment vanished. The fear vanished. Rep. Laced by a profound, shaking awe. We didn't know, Threx whispered. Now you do, Vance said. The peace we brought you, the restructuring, it's boot camp. We are getting you ready, because in 6 months we are going to drop the quarantine. We are going to take the fleets of the Concordat, upgraded, optimized, and united, and we are going to deploy them to the outer rim. Vance pointed to the bruising darkness on the map. There's a reason humans were banned from the battlefield, Chancellor. It's because the real battlefield is a place where sanity goes to die, and now we need you to join us there. The realization settled over the room. The HFY arrogance of the past, the fear of the apex predator, all of it was petty. Humans weren't the apex predators, they were the weary custodians. They were the ones holding the roof up while the house caught fire. Threx straightened his carapace. He looked at the map. He looked at the red darkness threatening to consume all of creation. And for the first time in 20 years, he felt the stirrings of a true purpose, not the petty squabbles over borders, but a fight for existence itself. The Orokin are yours, Admiral, Threx said, his voice firm. Logic dictates that we survive. If the cost of survival is fighting the end of time, then we fight. Vance nodded, and for the first time a genuine smile touched his lips. Good, then let's get to work. We have a universe to save. The transition was not easy. The revelation that the godlike humans were actually desperate defenders holding back a cosmic apocalypse shattered the worldview of every species in the Concordat. The religious castes of the Lyrans had to rewrite their scriptures. The Vanier warriors had to accept that their glory was meaningless in the face of an enemy that ate physics. But the truth, harsh as it was, provided a unity that politics never could. Under human direction, the galaxy transformed. It became a fortress. The gas giant Xylos was converted into a massive fuel refinery for the reality anchors. The asteroid belts were smelted down to build the orcs asterisk, massive dreadnoughts designed not to shoot lasers, but to project the stasis fields on a galactic scale. The Korsh integrated fully with the human AI, creating a strategic consciousness capable of micromanaging a war front spanning 1 billion light-years. 6 months later, the preparations were complete. The combined fleet gathered at the edge of the galaxy. It was a sight that defied description. Millions of vessels, human needles, Orokin monoliths, Vanier assault cruisers, Lyran psionic amplifiers, all floating in formation, a sea of metal and light against the starfield. Admiral Vance stood on the bridge of the asterisk syllogism asterisk with Chancellor Threx by his side. The wall is failing in Sector 9, Vance said, watching the telemetry. The enemy is pushing through. This is it. Threx looked at the human. He looked different now. The boredom was gone. The calm mask was replaced by the intense, burning focus of a predator. This was the face of the human that the legends spoke of, the face of the species that refused to accept the impossible. Open the channel to the fleet, Vance ordered. The comms opened. A billion souls listened. This is Admiral Vance. For 300 years, humanity stood between you and the abyss. We did it because we could. We did it because it was right. But today we stand together. The enemy before us is the end of all things. It is the silence that follows the heat death of the universe. It does not hate us, it simply wants us to cease. Vance paused, and his voice rose, echoing with a ferocity that shook Threx to his core. But we are the sentients of the Milky Way. We are the Orcian who tamed the gravity wells. We are the Vanir who never surrender. We are the Lyrans who dream the future. And we are humanity, the species that looked at the laws of physics and said no. A roar went up from the fleet, a sound of defiance transmitted across 1,000 frequencies. The ban is gone, Vance shouted. The gloves are off all ships. Engage. The fleet moved, but they didn't just fly. The human engines, now installed on every allied ship, tore open the fabric of space. The entire armada blinked out of existence, jumping instantaneously to the outer rim, to the tier in the universe where the purple darkness was leaking in. The sight that greeted them was madness. The enemy was a storm of impossible geometry, fractals of anti-reality that clawed at the human defensive line. The great white ships of the original human guard were burning, their hulls flickering as they struggled to maintain the reality anchors. Reinforce the center. Threx roared, taking command of the logistical flow. Orcian shield walls front, Vanir kinetic batteries suppress the smaller fractals, Lyrans stabilize the minds of the pilots. The combined fleet slammed into the enemy with the force of a supernova. The human technology wed them to hurt the abstraction. The Orcian shields held back the decay. The Vanir fury drove them into the teeth of the storm. For the first time in centuries, the humans weren't fighting alone. And for the first time, the enemy flinched. On the bridge, Vance watched the tactical map turn from a losing battle to a stalemate, and then to a pushback. The purple bruise began to shrink. The combined will of 5 sentient species, armed with the power to rewrite physics, was forcing the entropy back into its own dimension. We are holding, Corrine reported, tears streaming down her face. Admiral, the numbers, we are pushing them back. The wall is stabilizing. Vance let out a breath he felt he had been holding for a lifetime. He looked at Threx. The large alien was frantically directing supply lines, his 4 eyes darting across screens, a master of logistics in his element. We banned ourselves, Vance murmured, half to himself, because we thought we had to carry the burden alone. We were arrogant. Threx heard him. He paused, looking up. No, Admiral, you were protecting your children, but children grow up. Vance nodded slowly. Yeah, they do. He turned back to the view screen, where the combined fire of a united galaxy was burning a hole in the darkness, a beacon of defiance lighting up the edge of the universe. Now they know, Vance said, a fierce grin finally breaking his stoic mask. Now the universe knows you don't ban humans from the battlefield because they are too dangerous. Threx finished the thought, his mandibles clicking in a smile. You ban them because if you let them in, they will change the rules of the game until they win. Exactly, Vance said. Helm, advance the line, let's finish this. The syllogism surged forward, leading the charge into the abyss, no longer a lonely sentinel, but the spearhead of a galaxy that would not go gentle into that good night. The ban was broken. The war had begun, and for the first time in history, the outcome wasn't a calculation. It was a promise.